About Thomas Gainsborough, one of the leading portrait and landscape artists of 18th century England. He was also one of the founders of the Royal Academy. He was noted for his quick and slight brushwork, and he became famous as a society portrait painter, but his real love was always landscape, and he spent a lot of his life outside of London, which was the centre of the art world in England, living in the countryside for a long time near Bath. But let's start at the beginning of his life. He wasn't from an artistic family. His father was a weaver, but Gainsborough was clearly an artistic prodigy from an early age. He was painting small heads and landscapes by the age of 10, and he painted this self-portrait when he was 13. Interestingly, new research shows that his career was assisted by a double murder. Let me explain. He had an uncle and a cousin who were both also called Thomas, and they were killed in a revenge attack by criminals after being warned that they shouldn't pursue a debt. In his will, the uncle left £40 to Gainsborough, who was then 11, with the proviso that he put it towards light handicraft, and so that money was invaluable, as Gainsborough's father was then bankrupt. 2 years later, when he was 13, he left home for London to train as an artist. Let me tell you a bit about his personality. This is a self-portrait painted later. He was about 30 when he painted this. He suffered fools gladly, or he didn't suffer fools gladly. He hated humbug. He had a lot of musical ability. He was a good musician. He was a lively wit. He was always stubborn, temperamental, and had a very clear understanding of his own abilities. He was mostly self-taught. He disliked the studio system used by his rivals, and that was a problem because it meant that his productivity and therefore his capacity to earn money was limited by his own output. And so he addressed this by learning a speedy painting technique. Now, as I said, he became a leading portrait painter, but disliked painting portraits. How do we know that? Well, he wrote in a letter, "They think that they reward your merit by their company. But I know that they have but one part worth looking at, and that is their purse. Their hearts are seldom near enough the right place to get sight of." He's obviously here talking about the rich and wealthy, the typical patrons whose portraits he painted. And he worked hard. He'd start early, well, about 11 o'clock in the morning. He'd pause for refreshments at 1 and have his main meal at 3. And he would fit in 2 to 4 sittings a day. So by the end of the day, he was exhausted, but it's said that he relieved the stress through sex, drink, wild living and music. He was perhaps what we call today a good time city boy, but he wasn't a fool. He was always alert to the main chance, and he never went too far in any of these activities. He loved landscape painting, and he deeply affected John Constable, who was born some 25 years later. Constable said, "The landscape of Gainsborough is soothing, tender, and affecting. On looking at them, we have tears in our eyes and know not what brings them." As I said, he was also a talented musician. And let me give a quick summary of his life. Very quick. He was born in Suffolk, in fact, not far from where John Constable was born. I think it was about 10 miles away. When he was 13, as I said, he moved to London. When he was 19, he married Margaret Burr. She was the illegitimate daughter of the 3rd Duke of Beaufort, and he settled £200 annuity on her. when he was 31, he moved to Bath. He was very ill when he was 35 and was in fact reported dead in the local newspaper. In 47, when he was 47, he moved to London. And by the time he was 53, he was extremely well-known society painter, and he achieved the ultimate. He painted for royalty, and he died when he was 61. Let me tell you about his two brothers, a big contrast. This is the first portrait Gainsborough is known to have painted of any of his siblings, and the only example he painted of his siblings in Ipswich. Now, this is his brother Humphrey, and he was a nonconformist minister, but with a flair, or more than a flair, a great skill for engineering. He was known as a man of learning, which explains the format of this portrait. This harsh profile was used earlier in the century as a format to honour men of letters and scholars. I'll just briefly give you some idea of the things he invented. He invented a drill plough in 1766, which made 3 drills, sowed the seed and covered the seed, which won him a £60 prize. He invented the tide mill, which allowed the mill wheel to rotate with the water going in and out, winning a £50 prize. He designed a self-ventilating fish wagon. He designed a bridge near Henley. He did engineering work and improved the slope of a road near Henley. And he showed a model of a condensing steam engine to James Watt, who had been working independently. And we believe Watt included some of, or at least built on, Gainsborough's ideas. So he's probably less well known than he should be. This is Humphrey Gainsborough, perhaps because of the fame of his brother. One other thing he invented, which is interesting. Do you know those security chains we put on our door? There's a plate, you lift the chain across and hook it to a plate on the door. He invented that as well, and they're still in use today. This is a much later painting of the same brother. It's a rare example for Gainsborough of the sitter looking upwards like this. I guess it's done to suggest the way that saints were shown in old master paintings, looking up to heaven. So Gainsborough is honouring the religious beliefs of his brother. He was the most distinguished of Gainsborough's siblings. And he was the older brother. This is the other brother, known as Scheming Jack. Now, Scheming Jack was also an inventor, but an unsuccessful inventor. Must be terrible to have a successful brother who's a great inventor. Well, you invent things that never seem to take off. And talking about taking off, he invented a flying machine with copper wings, which failed, a cradle which rocked itself, a cuckoo that would sing all year round, a wheel that turned in a still bucket of water, and he claimed to have an invention to discover longitude. Now, all of these schemes demanded money, and all of his schemes failed. And interestingly, this painting is signed Gainsborough on the back, which, if it's an original signature, may be a punning reference to his brother's chronic pleas for financial support. He always, although everything failed, he always had some scheme on the go which always needed finance. And his explanation as to why they all failed is that he was never given enough money and enough time to see them through. I mentioned he married when he was 19. This is the following year. And this is Gainsborough with his wife Margaret. And we believe the child may therefore be his firstborn, but short-lived daughter Mary, who died in 1748. It could be the painting is a bit later, 1750, say, and this is Gainsborough's eldest surviving daughter, also called Mary, which was quite common to name, if a child died, to name the next child with the same name. He's painting himself and his family as fashionable gentlefolk, and he was always keen to establish his credentials as a gentleman, possibly because of his father's bankruptcy. And the piece of paper he's got in his hand is perhaps a sketch, but we can't see what it is now because it's become transparent with age. And he painted this for the family. It's that's why it's unfinished. And also it's been pointed out, it's a bit difficult to see, but if you look at the bottom of Margaret's legs, you can still see what at the time would have been regarded as a risque glimpse of her right calf through the muslin apron. Now, about this time, around the early 1750s, he could only charge £5 a head for a portrait, and it appears he fell into debt at this point, but he put more energy into finding new clients, and he was successful. But before I talk about that success, let me show you a few portraits he painted of his wife. This is his wife 10 years later, 1758. And it shows his ability to paint fashionable ladies. She's dressed as a fashionable lady, and he would have displayed this portrait in his home, in his studio, where clients were invited to see his portraits, and they could also see his wife, and so they could judge how accurately he could convey somebody's appearance and personality. And the style he chooses is an echo of Anthony van Dyck over 100 years previously, and Peter Lely. And he's depicting his wife as an aristocratic beauty. She was, as I said, the illegitimate daughter of a duke. So it was, in that sense, appropriate. She's wearing the latest French fashion, and the low-cut dress, although daring, was acceptable for the period. It was the fashion. She was considered very pretty, kind, and virtuous. And by the way, the annuity I mentioned of £200 was paid annually for the rest of her life. Another 20 years later, he painted her when she was 50. It may have been a birthday present for her 50th birthday. He had gone to Bath and left Bath by this stage. I'll come back to that later. And it was at this point that he hired a house and studio in Pall Mall in London. And by this stage, by the time he painted this, he'd become one of England's leading portraitists. And it's said that he painted a portrait of Margaret each year on their wedding anniversary. It's a well-known and striking portrait, this one. There's a suggestion of intimacy. She's looking straight towards us. She's meeting our gaze directly. There's an enigmatic smile. It may be a smile it may also, perhaps, if you look at her eyes, suggest resignation. And it's starting to paint in his energetic late style of powerful swirls of paint. He, as I've said, he was known to be a very fast painter. And the final portrait of his wife, much reduced, much smaller format. So it's a more intimate portrait miniature. So clearly painted to be seen in the privacy of the family. And she died 10 years later, aged 68 or 69 in 1798, which was 10 years after Gainsborough had died. This was painted towards the end of Gainsborough's life. Now, I said he loved painting portraits, and what I've done now, after introducing you to his family, is to jump back to the early part of his career. He moved to London in 1740. He studied art under the engraver Hubert Gravelot, but he became, while he was in London, he became associated with William Hogarth and assisted the well-known artist Francis Hayman, and working together they painted the supper boxes at Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. He went back to Suffolk to become a landscape artist, and this is one of the early landscapes he painted depicting a rural scene, rolling hills, looking onto a village in the distance in the Dutch tradition. And that's how he taught himself. He taught himself to paint landscapes by studying Dutch old masters like Ruysdael. Very different from the idealized landscapes you might have seen of Claude and Poussin. And this is one of the most famous of his early landscapes, Cornard Wood, near his hometown of Sudbury, where he was born in Suffolk. It shows his skill in capturing the atmosphere and light of the English countryside. The church you can see right in the background is St. Mary's in Great Henry. In reality, incidentally, it was even further away. And the woods that are shown here were common land. So the locals had a right to graze animals and gather wood and take sand for building purposes. And you can see here in the centre right there's two donkeys grazing. There's a man on the other side of the lane resting with his spade, with a woman sitting next to him. And there's another man in front walking towards the village with a dog, a man right in the foreground who's tying up firewood. The sunlit trees on the left contrast with the shadow around the pool on the right. Incidentally, the sky has faded. It was Prussian blue, so it would have been a brighter blue when he painted it. And it's important because its sale financed him travelling to London. He was a bit disparaging about it. He described it later as schoolboy style, lacking in composition. But he also said the touch and closeness to nature are equal to any of my later productions. And as I said, this work, the composition is no longer criticised. It seemed to be a very clever composition with the contrast of the light and the dark parts of the wood. Even better known, a very well-known Gainsborough portrait stroke landscape, painted while he was still living in his hometown that he went back to of Sudbury. An early masterpiece, painted around 1750, now in the National Gallery. About 2 miles from Gainsborough's home, and the people in it were friends of his, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And it's not a fictional landscape, but it is their estate with All Saints Church in the background, just above where her dress turns. It's therefore the landscape, because it is their estate, is part of what makes them who they are, and so it's part in a way of their portrait. The lighting, the colour balance, the cloud formations, the sweep of the landscape all make a perfect composition. He has a gun under his arm. His wife sits on an elaborate Rococo-style wooden bench. The costumes, by the way, were probably painted from dressed-up mannequins. In other words, he didn't paint this in the open air. He didn't get them to stand there like that. And that may account for their doll-like appearance. He would have studied the landscape separately on the spot, but they would have he would have done their portraits in the studio as sketches and then combined it with the drawings and painting of the dressed-up mannequins. By the way, if you look at her lap, you can see the painting's unfinished, and we don't know why it was left unpainted, and we don't know what he intended to put there. Some people suggest it's a cock pheasant that her husband has just shot. But the dating is a bit wrong for the state of the corn. The legal start of pheasant season was in September the 1st. So it could have been a work bag for embroidery or anything else, a book, a fan, a lapdog. And this convention, this type of painting is what we call a conversation piece. Usually small-scale portraits, 2 or more people, often out of doors, although many are indoors, and usually idealized when they're outside. This has got accurate cloud formations and a naturalistic scenery. Let me tell you about the reaction of some art critics so you can see how this has been viewed by art historians and critics over the years. The most famous art critic, Kenneth Clark, said, "This enchanting work is painted with such love and mastery." Sir John Rothenstein wrote, "There are few interpretations of civilized man in his relations with cultivated nature more lovely or psychologically profound." But on the other hand, the Marxist art critic John Berger, in his book Ways of Seeing, said, "They are landowners and their proprietary attitude towards what surrounds them is visible in their stance and expression." And that idea has been picked up by other art historians who talk about the capitalist relationship between 18th century owners and their property. There's no farm workers in sight, for example. In contrast again, more recently, the art critic Andrew Graham Dixon wrote, "In its quiet, understated way, one of the masterpieces of erotic painting." You might wonder why or what is erotic about it. Andrew Graham Dixon mentions Robert's, Robert's clothes are almost falling off him. They are so loose and floppy, while Frances has a melted, languorous look about her. I'm not sure about either of those points, but it's an interesting point of view. And then finally, Erica Langmuir talks about the most tartly lyrical picture in the history of art. And she talks about how the figures stand out brittle against the glorious yet ordered bounty, how marvellously the acid blue hooped skirt is deployed, almost but not quite rhyming with the curved bench back. her pointy silk shoes in sly communion with the bench feet, while Mr. Andrews' substantial shoes converse with tree roots. More rhymes and assences link the lines of the gun, thighs, dog, calf, coat. A coat tail answers the hanging ribbon of a sun hat. Something jaunty in the husband's tricorn catches the corner of his wife's eye. Deep affection and naive artifice combine to create the earliest successful depiction of a truly English idyll. So that's a few critics and their view of this well-known masterpiece. In 1752, he, with his wife and two daughters, Mary known as Molly, and Margaret, known as Peggy, moved to Ipswich. His commissions increased, but he still wasn't making a great deal of money from portraits, and his clients were mainly local merchants and squires, still only making about, depending on the size of the portrait, but about £5 for each portrait. So he had to borrow at this stage against his wife's annuity to live in the manner appropriate to a country gentleman. We know when he painted this sketch, it's because it's written on the back, painted by Thomas Gainsborough at Ipswich about the year 1754. Second sitting of himself, aged 28, is what's written on the back. It's a painting that's never been relined, and it's this pose. You can just about make out he's got his hand in his waistcoat, and this was one of the popular poses for male sitters round about this period, 1730s to 1750s. And also what he's wearing, the frock coat, had just come into fashion for country gentlemen. So again, he's wearing the latest fashion of a country gentleman. I mentioned his daughters. Let me tell you a bit more about them and show you some of their portraits. They were born in Sudbury, his hometown, before they moved to Ipswich. And this is one of the best known painters. It's in fact been described as one of the most remarkable paintings of the 18th century for its sensitivity and rapid technique. It's Mary and Margaret. Mary, who, as I said, took the name of his first daughter who died, and Margaret, who was born a year later. So they were 5 and 6 when this was painted, which was probably painted in Ipswich. And it's a demonstration of what was understood at the time by the term sensibility, which is an acute perception of or a responsiveness towards something, such as the emotions of another person. Gainsborough took full advantage of the fact that he had 2 lovely paintable daughters. Now, Mary is the elder on the right, and her personality was, she was cool, poised and wise and restrained, and Margaret, the younger, on the left, was impulsive and heedless of danger. And you can see that he's illustrating that here. They're emerging from a dark wood. Mary, the elder, looks wary as she constrains the impetuous Margaret, who's trying to leap forward to grasp the fragile symbol of beauty, the butterfly, which is just alighting on a thistle. In other words, she's unaware of the danger of being pricked by one of the thorns, whereas her sister is aware of that and is trying to control her impulsiveness. So as well as showing love and tenderness, in terms of technique, he's experimenting, you can see here, with loose brushwork. It would have been unacceptable with a paying client at this stage of his career. But it's something, it enabled him to paint more quickly, and so it's something he developed and started to use in his later paintings, as we shall see. Surprisingly, he didn't take this painting with him when later they moved to Bath, but he left it with a friend, a headmaster in Ipswich School. And this painting, there's a lot of similar paintings. Let me just compare it with one by William Hogarth, who didn't have any children. This is called The Mackinnon Children. It's in the National Gallery in Ireland, and it's similar as a boy, this time reaching out to grasp a butterfly that's alighted on a sunflower. Not quite the same psychological depth as a butterfly alighting on a thorn with the or on a thistle with the danger of the thorns. They're a bit older here. This is unfinished, and at the time of his death, it was cut into two and sold to different collectors. After one of the collectors died, the other purchased it and commissioned a restorer, this is in the 1870s, about 100 years later, to reunite the paintings. And it was decided to place their heads at the same level and add a few, as you can see, black outlines to join Mary's shoulder to the rest of her arm. And recently it was realised that Mary would have been looking down on her younger sister, and from a greater height and at a further distance. Maybe more like that on the original painting. They're now older. Mary's about 9 or 10, Margaret about 8 or 9. And he has moved with his family from Ipswich to Bath. He moved in 1759, and so this was probably painted in Bath. It's unfinished, but you can see the outline. It may not be obvious at first. I've marked it. Can you see the outline of a cat's head there, the 2 eyes and 2 ears? There's if you follow it down, you can see the body of a cat, and right the way down to where their hands are, one of them is pulling the cat's tail. So it's sort of an amusing picture. The next painting of his daughters is 1763, and it was at this time that the Bath Journal reported him dead. He wrote to a friend to say he'd succumbed to nervous fever, and hinted in the letter that as well as overwork, his illness had been brought on by overindulging in sexual pleasures during his visit to London. In other words, he had venereal disease, which he recovered from. Now, it was fashionable for young women to learn drawing and watercolours as hobbies, but Gainsborough trained his daughters to be professional artists. He was worried they should miss getting husbands. And this was a revolutionary idea for the 18th century. His idea was that they could make money from landscape painting. Even if he failed to make enough money for them to live on after his death, and if they failed to marry. The sculpture here, by the way, is the Farnese Flora. So it's a female sculpture representing the goddess of spring. The Margaret at the back has a large swathe of blue satin over her arm. Mary's white bodice is covered in flowers, signifying the future promise of nature. And to make sure that they were properly educated, he sent them to an exclusive boarding school in Chelsea, which was just outside London at this time. And he also, as I said, tutored them in drawing and landscape painting to a professional standard. A few years after this was painted, Mary, the one nearest to us, entered into a disastrous marriage. She married the celebrated oboist Johann Fischer, who was a friend of her father, and in later life she lived with her younger sister Margaret, although by then Mary was suffering from a severe mental illness, and Margaret looked after her. This is 1774. Gainsborough moved to London in this year, 1774, and began the final triumphant stage of his career. He took up residence in a popular area in the West End in Pall Mall, and created a house and a studio there. And he may have painted this again to go on the walls as an example to show clients that came to the studio. And you can see here the daughters look every inch fine ladies. He was now one of the most popular and becoming one of the wealthiest artists. And he had just become, or he was just a founding member of the Royal Academy, which was founded in 1768. And by the end of this decade, the end of the 1770s, he had achieved the highest goal of any painter, portrait painter, when he secured the patronage of the royal family. This is the only one of 6 double portraits of his daughters that can be described as finished, and it's the largest and the most formal. The dog, by the way, is normally introduced to symbolize fidelity, and it's normally associated with marriage portraits. He may have been signaling their emotional closeness. And it seems that both sisters had delusions of grandeur because of their mother's paternity. They were essentially granddaughters of a duke. Gainsborough described them as having airs and being too proud, too insolent, and too disobedient. And in fact, in later life, Mary fancied herself as royalty and wouldn't receive any visitor who didn't have a title. And so people who came to see her, who had business with her, would invent titles so they could see her. And they both, by this stage, looked down on their father as a lowly artist. 2 more portraits. This is the younger daughter, Margaret, in her mid-20s. And although he, as I've said, enjoyed a reckless social life, he attempted to shield his daughters from the attentions of would-be suitors. He, in his words, make fine trumpery of them and let them be led away with vanity and ever subject to disappointment in the wild goose chase. So he could see that it was going to be very difficult for them to find a suitable match. And Margaret remained unmarried, as did Mary, and lived out the final years in Acton, which is West London, where she cared for her elder sister. And her elder sister Mary, shown here. Gainsborough was very fond of his daughters. He frequently painted them, as you've seen, He painted them from childhood to their late 20s. He was concerned about their future. He made sure they were well educated. As I said, he sent them to an exclusive boarding school. Now, Mary married without her father's permission, and to complicate matters, Margaret thought that the man she married, the oboist Fisher, was in love with her. So the marriage led to unhappiness, disagreement, argument between the two girls. And within a year of their marriage, the couple were in dire financial straits. Gainsborough discovered she'd ordered expensive fabrics and tried to sell them immediately, with the illegal proceeds going to her and her husband. So borderline fraud. Gainsborough wrote to his sister, "She has convinced me she would go to the gallows to serve this man." She was still devoted to him, but the marriage only lasted a few more years. And in his will, Gainsborough left everything to his wife and to Margaret, with instructions to provide Mary with what she needed, because he was worried that her husband, and they never divorced, her husband Fisher would claim her inheritance. Mary was sly, headstrong, impulsive, and unstable. And when she was quite young, she started to show signs of mental illness. And by 1771, the family doctor had given up on her, said that she'd never recover her senses. And it's possible Gainsborough himself had been affected by something similar when he was extremely ill in 1763. In later life, after the death of their mother, Margaret looked after Mary. Now, Margaret herself suffered from what was called at the time bouts of eccentricity. A visitor from Ipswich summed it up as, "Margaret is odd in her behaviour, and her sister quite deranged." So that's finished with his daughters. Let's move back to Bath, in which he moved to in 1759, and where he became an almost overnight success. Bath, of course, was the spa town that high society moved to, and in the summer. And this painting of Anne Ford was painted just before she became the wife of Gainsborough's friend, Philip Thicknesse. And it was this painting that helped to establish his reputation amongst the fashionable high society. And she was a bit of celebrity, or there was scandal as well. So she was very well known. She was well known for her beauty, and she was an amateur musician. And to take full advantage of her, maybe notoriety is the right word, Gainsborough has painted this full-length portrait. She came from a wealthy family, Anne Ford, and was extremely talented at music, but her father refused to let her play in public because it looked as though she was earning money and they were too wealthy for that. But she disobeyed him. So he arranged for her to be arrested and brought back home. So she left home, stayed with a friend, and arranged a public concert. And this created a scandal which added to her fame. And in this painting, Gainsborough has created this air of informality from the way she's sitting, and grandeur in the style of a painting in the style of Anthony van Dyck. And it was much admired, although it was regarded as slightly shocking because of her pose. Can you see the way she's crossed her legs? That was only men cross their legs. Women would in society would never cross their legs. And her gaze is looking forthright. So, with his success and growing fame in Bath, that enabled him to start exhibiting his work in London before he moved to London. Oh, I thought I'd show you this. It's the The small dog on the left is called Fox. It's a Spitz or Pomeranian that belonged to Gainsborough. And the larger Old English sheepdog called Tristram belongs to his wife Margaret. And if we were to take them as surrogates for their partners, it appears Tristram is in charge. That's Margaret, and it's possible that he intended this as a sort of with wry amusement, a comment on their marriage by painting this sort of double portrait of their pets. Now, in the 1760s, which was then when this was painted, is when he became one of the most sought after portrait artists in the country and started to become financially successful. The other leading portrait artist, by the way, was Joshua Reynolds, who was a bit more conservative, shall we say, as an artist. Reynolds was calm, sociable, very well connected, and came from a learned family. Gainsborough was volatile, prickly, easily angered, and as we know, his father was a failed cloth merchant and weaver. I should say, though, that although he was impulsive, Gainsborough's language, although it was often vulgar and bawdy, he was also shrewd enough to know that he should speak properly in the appropriate circumstances. He was a great ladies' man. He was said to have flirted with the women he painted and with his female acquaintances. He would sign letters, "Yours to the hilt," which is fairly obviously a sexual reference. Often described as an artist who painted landscapes and loved painting landscapes, hated painting portraits, and there's various evidence in his letters for that. Let me just pick out one quote from his letters. "I'm sick of portraits and wish very much to take my viol da gamba and walk off to some sweet village where I can paint landscapes," the term at the time for landscapes. I should add, though, that in that letter he also mentions he'd been spurned after flirting with one of his female sitters. She told him to go. So it's possible that that was just a spur of the moment reaction, although I think it's clear from other letters that he did much prefer painting landscapes. And by the way, you might be thinking about painting outside. Very few artists painted outside at this stage. He used models. Let me give you a quote from Joshua Reynolds. "He framed a kind of model of landscapes on his table, composed of broke stones, dried herbs, and pieces of looking glass, which he magnified and improved into rocks, trees, and water." So he created these little landscapes in miniature on the table and used those combined, I would guess, with sketches of nature to produce these paintings in the studio. Note how carefully he's arranged this composition. The two women, by the way, are based on his daughters and probably inspired by the countryside around Bath. And his landscapes, another indication that he loved painting landscapes, is they weren't commissioned. He painted them for pleasure. He did sometimes sell them, and this painting he gave to a friend as thanks for giving him a grey horse. In fact, it's the grey horse at the front in this painting. He painted two versions of this painting. One 17 years later is now in Toronto. And this is 1767. It's 1768, as I said, that the Royal Academy was founded, and Gainsborough was one of the founders. The president, of course, was his rival, Joshua Reynolds. And over the years, he had many Gainsborough had many disagreements with the Royal Academy, mainly to do with how his painting should be displayed. And in fact, he refused to exhibit on many occasions. We arrive at perhaps his best known work, The Blue Boy. It's in California, the Huntington Art Gallery. It's an iconic portrait of a young man in an unusual blue suit. It's in fact in the style of Van Dyck, and so it's an homage to Anthony Van Dyck. The clothes he's wearing were about 100 years out of date by this time. It's long been thought it's a portrait of the son of a wealthy merchant called Jonathan Buttle, although one art historian has recently argued it could be Gainsborough's nephew, Gainsborough Dupont. And there's a story, it's a very nice story, but about why the boy is dressed in blue. It's that Gainsborough's rival, the president of the Royal Academy, Joshua Reynolds, said in one of his discourses, his annual lectures, that if a blue, grey or green predominate in a painting, then, quote, it will be out of the power of art, even in the hands of Rubens and Titian, to make a picture splendid and harmonious, end quote. And Gainsborough is said to have painted this to prove him wrong. A lovely story, but unfortunately, this was painted 8 years before Reynolds gave that lecture. A double portrait of the Lindley sisters, Elizabeth and Mary Lindley. It's the only portrait we have of them together. When Gainsborough moved to Bath, he became good friends with the Lindley family and produced a number of portraits of them. Elizabeth is the eldest. She's the one wearing pale blue and gazing into the distance, and her hand, if you look, is resting on a guitar. The other one is Mary. She's wearing golden brown and has a score on her lap, a music score, because the Lindley family were famous musicians and known as, the two of them were known as the nest of the Nightingales. Elizabeth for her voice and beauty, appeared first as a singer in Covent Garden in 1767 and became one of the most highly sought after singers of oratorios. Mary made her public debut as an actress at Theatre Royal in Covent Garden in 1769, 2 years later, and then followed her sister's footsteps as a singer of oratorios. But once they were married, they were forbidden to sing in public. And therefore Elizabeth retired at just 18 and Mary at 22, as many have said, depriving the music world of their beautiful voices. Elizabeth had a love life, a dramatic love life that was the talk of society. She broke off an engagement to a Walter Long in 1771, reputedly because of an affair she had with Captain Thomas Matthews, who was married, a married friend of the family. But by 1772, the following year, it's believed she fled to France with Richard Brinsley Sheridan. This is a famous portrait of him by Gainsborough, who acted as her escort. And the idea was she would enter a convent in Lille, but she ended up marrying Sheridan in 1773, and Sheridan and Matthews had, before they married, fought a duel, in fact 2 duels, for her hand. What happened was Matthew had written an article defaming the character of Elizabeth, and in the event, in the duel, Matthew lost his sword and had to beg for his life and sign a retraction of the article. But then, because the apology, the retraction, was made public, Matthew challenged Sheridan again to another duel. This was much more aggressive. Both men broke their swords. Both were wounded. Sheridan had part of his ear stuck through with Matthew's sword. His whole body was covered in wounds, his face beaten to jelly. And yet he managed to recover in a couple of weeks and married. He was the one who married Elizabeth. And this is Elizabeth Anne Linley, the Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan. She sadly died of tuberculosis when she was just 38. Both her parents were musicians, which is how she started singing in public. She started singing in public, by the way, when she was 9, and her debut at Covent Garden, she was only 13. Gainsborough is combining here his love of landscape with portraiture, with a strong romantic component. He's painted her with a calm, very well delineated expression. And she's the center of this sort of swirling natural world painted with long, free-flowing, delicate brushstrokes. So to give the impression of a windswept landscape. I mentioned Gainsborough Dupont. He was born in Sudbury in 1754, the eldest son of Gainsborough's sister, Sarah, and her husband, Philip Dupont. And Gainsborough Dupont was apprenticed to Gainsborough, and he continued to work with him until Gainsborough's death in 1788, and he was the only assistant that Gainsborough is ever known to have employed. As I said, he didn't believe in the studio system. Now, Gainsborough Dupont trained at the Royal Academy School, and he took over Gainsborough's studio when Gainsborough died, moved to Bloomsbury when Margaret Gainsborough's widow died, and he painted portraits and landscapes in the style of Gainsborough. And he imitated the style of Nicolas Poussin. And this particular portrait of Gainsborough Dupont by Thomas Gainsborough is a bravura display of Gainsborough's power. It took less than an hour to paint this portrait. A friend described it as more like the work of God than man. And he's wearing a 17th century costume, maybe in respect to Van Dyck. This was bought and soon entered the collection of an aristocratic connoisseur. It's now owned by the Rothschild family. We believe this was, or part of this was painted by Thomas Gainsborough, but we believe some of it was reworked by his nephew Gainsborough Dupont. Thomas Gainsborough is in his mid-40s. It was left unfinished when he died, and we believe that it was completed, as I said, by his nephew. The jacket is a copy of one that it was on the self-portrait that he painted for the Royal Academy in 1787, and this was an early work purchased by Samuel Courtauld. And it was round about this time, 1774, when this portrait was begun, which was when he moved to his studio in London, in Pall Mall. As I said, in the 1780s, he had achieved the epitome of a portrait artist, of being commissioned by the king, in this case, to paint 3 of the eldest sisters of George IV. The painting had a couple of problems. The first was that, I mean, it's a wonderful portrait, but the hanging committee at the Royal Academy, reasonably enough, I think, decided to hang it above the line, which was about 2 foot above eye level, in other words, about 8 feet from the floor. And Gainsborough objected. He said the painting was designed to be hung no higher than 5.5 feet above the floor, because, in his words, he had painted this picture of the princesses in so tender a light, and by tender he was referring to the colouring, the subtle colouring, and this dreamy style of painting, which he believed had to be seen close up, so it couldn't be hung at the height the committee wanted to hang it. So the committee refused to hang it lower. Gainsborough withdrew the work and exhibited it in his studio in Pall Mall. And in fact, he refused at this point to ever send any work to the Academy again. And this suffered from another unfortunate incident. Many years later, in the Victorian period, Landseer, the famous animal painter, found one of Queen Victoria's staff cutting up the canvas to fit above a door. The person chopped a lot from the bottom and the top. Let me show you. This is a copy by Gainsborough Dupont, his nephew, which is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, of the original painting before it was chopped up. And you can see that it was chopped at the top and a lot was chopped off the bottom, simply to get it to fit in a particular place above a door. And we've come now to the last decade of his life, when he was undoubtedly one of the 2 leading artists in the country. This is Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and she was a famous beauty of the time, known for its luxuriousness and informality. She's adopted a theatrical pose surrounded by lush drapery, and it's on display in Chatsworth House, which is in Derbyshire. Oh, by the way, this large black hat was a style she made famous, and it became known as a Gainsborough hat, and he painted women wearing this large black hat in other portraits after it had been made famous by the Duchess. Oh, by the way, I should explain, it's quite an interesting story, how it arrived at Chatsworth House, or how it ended up at Chatsworth House, because it arrived at Chatsworth House because it was, that's the country home and estate of the Duke of Devonshire, who commissioned the painting, but it disappeared. It was lost from Chatsworth House. They didn't know where it had gone. It was then discovered in the home of an elderly schoolmistress who'd cut it down again to fit above her fireplace. And she sold it to an art dealer who gave it to a friend. And when he died, it was auctioned by Christie's and bought by the art dealer William Agnew, a very famous art dealer, for 10,000 guineas, an astronomical sum, the highest price ever paid at auction at that time. Unbelievably, 3 weeks later it was stolen, and there were many sightings reported in the press over a large number of years, but it wasn't for 25 years. 25 years later, it became known that it had been stolen by Adam Worth, who was known at the time as the Napoleon of crime, a very famous thief, who stole it to sell it to pay the bail of his brother, but his brother was released without bail, without him needing to pay the bail. So he decided to keep it. He took it back to his home country, the United States. In 1901, many years later, he negotiated the sale of this picture through the detective agency Pinkerton's. You couldn't make this stuff up, for $25,000. It was sold in London to J.P. Morgan, who travelled to London to buy it, for $150,000, remained in his family till 1994, when it was sold by Sotheby's and bought by the 11th Duke of Devonshire for $408,000. So, after 200 years, it eventually returned to the family home of Chatsworth. What an interesting history it had. This is Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett, also called The Morning Walk, a double portrait in celebration of their love and companionship. They're shown depicted strolling hand in hand through a beautiful landscape shortly before their marriage in 1785, accompanied by their Pomeranian sheepdog, as I said, symbol of fidelity. And again, by this stage, you can see particularly clearly in this painting the light, feathery feel to his painting. This light brushwork is typical of his late style. Now, he, Mr. William Hallett, had made a fortune when he inherited his grandfather's fortune, which had been made because his grandfather was a fashionable cabinet maker, and she had a fortune she'd inherited of £20,000. They both married when they were 21. They had 2 sons and 4 daughters, and he said he'd lived most happily for nearly 48 years with her. But it must have been a difficult time for her. Her maiden name was Elizabeth Stephen, because he was addicted to gambling, mostly horse racing, and the gambling and 2 disastrous property deals were his downfall, and nothing was left of his fortune. But luckily, his wife's fortune was safe, we believe, because it was tied up in trust funds. His wife died before him, and he remarried a year later, tried to sell this painting, but failed to sell it, and it was left in his will to his daughter, which is how it eventually ended up in the National Gallery. Getting towards the end now of this talk, this is the Market Cart, 1786, getting towards the end of his life. He loved landscape painting. We see here a horse-drawn cart laden down with vegetables. In fact, so many it looks as though they would bounce out of the cart as the horse goes along. It looks as though it's just about to go through a pond. Loose brushwork still capturing a sense of movement and energy of bustling market day. It's a large canvas. It's some 6 foot high and painted just 18 months before he died. Again, it's not an accurate representation of a particular place in the countryside, but neither is it an idealized countryside. Perhaps he was recollecting his boyhood in Suffolk. Painted the year before he died as a gift for one of his closest friends, the composer Carl Friedrich Abel, who was, I believe, a student of Johann Bach. The following year, when Gainsborough was terminally ill, so he knew he was dying, he left written instructions that this painting, this unfinished 3/4 sketch, as he called it, was to be the only likeness of his features that he would sanction to be engraved after his death. In other words, he was nominating this as the image by which he wished to be remembered. It was described at the time, its freedom and bold style, a person who knows well how to act and think like a gentleman, as he does to condemn and despise those who dare to treat him in any other light. And you can see them in this sort of almost haughty, that sharp scrutiny that he's giving us. It's certainly not modest. He died of cancer of the neck, and he's buried in Kew in St Anne's churchyard. Interesting note, on his deathbed, he worried he hadn't saved enough money for his daughters to be looked after. And it was only then, for the first time, did his long-suffering wife reveal that she'd been saving for 42 years, knowing he always threw his money about, and she had managed to save £10,000. Gainsborough had at last found the explanation for something that had always puzzled him, how he worked so hard but never seemed to have much money. And in deference to his wishes, this is the portrait that I've chosen to begin and to end this talk with, the only one that he wished to be reproduced in memory of his appearance. He was born a few miles from where John Constable was later born. He became one of the leading portrait painters and landscape painters of the 18th century. He was a founding member of the Royal Academy and known for his quick painting style, light, sensual palette, which defined the Rococo style in English portraiture. And he loved landscape painting, spent a lot of his career outside of London, and that enabled him to see and to sketch the English countryside. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to recording the next talk for you. Goodbye for now.